Welcome to the Lifelong Learner podcast. Join us as we explore the joy of continuous discovery and growth. Subscribe now.
Race, racism, and racialization. When we talk about race and ethnic studies, it's absolutely crucial to get that it's a social construct.
Right, not biological reality.
Not at all. But, and this is the key insight, isn't it? While it's biologically baseless, race has incredibly real effects. It shapes opportunities, who gets what resources, how we even see ourselves and others.
Yeah, profoundly.
Historically, it was basically designed as a tool, right, to categorize people and justify massive inequality. We're talking slavery, segregation.
And that legacy continues. It's visible today in disparities in employment, housing, education, the criminal justice system. It's still shaping things.
Absolutely. And building on that, racism. It's not just about someone having prejudiced thoughts.
No, not just individual bias. It's a systemic thing, a power structure, really rooted in beliefs of racial superiority that privileges white people.
And it works on different levels.
Definitely. Individual interactions, sure, but also within institutions, schools, banks, courts, and, across society as a whole. Historically, it was the bedrock for things like Jim Crow laws, colonialism, brutal system.
Which leads nicely into racialization. Can you unpack that a bit? Sounds like the process of making race stick to certain groups.
That's a good way to think about it. Racialization is the process of assigning racial identities to groups, often based on perceived traits, things that get stereotyped, and the result is often marginalization.
It seems kind of insidious, taking complex groups and just boiling them down to stereotypes to justify treating them badly.
Exactly. And it can be used to pit communities against each other, too. It shows up all over history and even today.
Like how? Any examples jump out?
Oh, plenty. During colonialism, Europeans labeled indigenous and African peoples savages. That was racialization used to justify exploitation, violence. More recently, think about the model minority myth applied to some Asian American groups.
Right, the idea that they're all successful.
Yeah, which totally masks the real inequalities within those communities. And it functions as a kind of wedge, right, to divide them from other communities of color. Or after 9/11. People perceived as Muslim, Arab, or South Asian were suddenly racialized as security threats. That led directly to more surveillance, hate crimes.
We see it in the justice system, too, don't we? Like how news reports sometimes emphasize the ethnicity of, say, Latino or Black suspects, but not white suspects.
That's a classic example. Or the war on drugs, which heavily racialized African Americans as criminals, and political rhetoric, like calling Mexican immigrants rapists or murderers. That's racialization used to dehumanize, to make discriminatory policies seem okay.
Wow, even the COVID pandemic.
Yep. Led to Asians and Asian Americans being racialized as disease carriers, echoing those old yellow peril tropes.
Okay, let's shift a bit. Ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism. These sound related.
They are. Ethnocentrism is sort of the general idea, judging other cultures based on your own culture standards, usually thinking yours is superior.
Okay.
Eurocentrism is a really specific, powerful form of ethnocentrism. It's a worldview that basically positions Europe, its culture, history, values, as the center of the world, as the standard, the default, the most important.
So it interprets everything else from that European perspective.
Pretty much, and often marginalizes or just ignores contributions from non-European societies.
Where did that come from historically?
You can trace it back to the European Renaissance, the Enlightenment. These periods created these kinds of intellectual hierarchies. They framed Europeans as the originators of universal logic, science. And that framing helped justify colonialism.
And how does it still operate today? Maybe in ways we don't always notice.
Oh, it's embedded in a lot of places. Education is a big one. Curricula often focus heavily on the white Western intellectual tradition, presenting it as the canon. Non-European ideas or key historical events like the Taino genocide might get left out entirely. Even maps. The common Mercator projection map actually distorts land sizes to make Europe look bigger and more central than it is.
I've heard that.
And things like English-only policies in U.S. schools that privileges English speakers, stigmatizes other languages. It reflects that same underlying bias.
Okay, this connects directly to white supremacy then.
It does, and it's important to understand white supremacy not just as, extremist groups. It's broader.
Right, it's an ideology.
An ideology of white racial dominance, yes, but also the institutionalized power structures that uphold it. Historically, it really took shape during the colonial era to justify the slave trade exploitation.
And it was written into law.
Absolutely. Chattel slavery, Jim Crow laws, even early U.S. law like the Naturalization Act of 1790, which explicitly limited citizenship to free white persons. It was built into the system.
Got it. Okay, moving to another really critical framework, intersectionality.
Yes, coined by the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. This one's super important.
What's the core idea?
It's about understanding that different forms of inequality like race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, ability, they don't operate separately. They overlap, they intersect, they combine.
So they create unique experiences of discrimination or privilege depending on the person.
Exactly. It's not just adding things up like race plus gender. It's about how those things interact to shape someone's specific reality.
The reading mentioned the Emma DeGraff and Reed case as an example.
Right. She was a Black woman who sued for discrimination, but the courts initially didn't know how to handle both race and gender discrimination together. Her case showed how the legal system often failed to see that combined experience.
It really highlights how these categories aren't neat boxes.
Precisely.
Okay, next up, imperialism. This sounds like countries extending power.
That's the gist. It's a state policy or practice of extending power and control over other nations, sometimes through direct takeover of territory, other times through political and economic control. Historically, we associate it strongly with European colonial expansion, from the 15th century onwards. The scramble for Africa is a key example.
And Marxist thinkers like Lenin saw it connected to capitalism.
Yes, he called it the highest stage of capitalism. The European colonization of the Americas is another prime example of classical imperialism.
But it's not just historical, right? There's neo-imperialism.
Absolutely. It looks different today, but the dynamics are similar. Think economic imperialism. Powerful states using debt, trade deals, or international institutions like the IMF and World Bank to exert influence. Structural adjustment programs, for example, or U.S. sanctions on countries like Venezuela, that's economic coercion. And there's cultural imperialism, too. The global dominance of one culture, often American culture via Hollywood, spreading specific values.
Right. Okay, one more foundational concept. Settler colonialism. How is this different?
It's a specific type of colonialism. The key difference is that the settlers come to stay. They aim to permanently replace the indigenous population and take over their land, asserting exclusive sovereignty.
So it's about elimination or replacement, not just resource extraction.
Exactly. And that's why it's often described as a structure, not an event. It's an ongoing process, not just something that happened in the past. It continues to work towards indigenous erasure.
And the origins are clear in places like the Americas, Australia.
Yes. Often justified by ideas like the doctrine of discovery. It's fundamentally about land and belonging.
Okay, that's a lot of heavy but really crucial groundwork. Let's shift now to the movements and strategies for liberation that grew in response. Self-determination seems central here.
Absolutely fundamental. It's the right of peoples to freely choose their own political, economic, social, and cultural path without outside control. It's explicitly recognized for Indigenous peoples in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRE.
And sovereignty is tied to that.
Very closely. Sovereignty is about supreme authority within a territory, but we need to distinguish between two kinds here.
Okay.
There's what's called Westphalian sovereignty. That's the idea that emerged in Europe, emphasizing the absolute power of a nation-state over its territory and people with no interference from others.
Right, like traditional borders and government control.
Yeah. Yes. But then there's Indigenous sovereignty. This is different. It's seen as an inherent right of Indigenous peoples to govern themselves, their lands, their resources, their cultures. A right that existed before colonial states arrived and continues despite them.
So it's not granted by the state, it pre-exists it.
Exactly. It's rooted in long histories of self-governance, spiritual connections to land, community responsibilities. Think of the Navajo Nation managing its own health services, for example. It challenges that Westphalian model.
That makes sense. Yeah. And that leads us right into decolonization.
Decolonization is about dismantling those colonial structures, not just political, but also structures of power, knowledge, culture. And importantly, it's about restoring Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous autonomy.
So challenging the dominant narratives, restoring rights.
Yes. Historically, we think of the big independence movements after World War II.
But it's ongoing today.
Very much so. Things like decolonizing the curriculum in universities, bringing in indigenous and global South perspectives to challenge those Eurocentric foundations we talked about. The land back movement is another powerful example. It's a demand for the literal return of stolen ancestral lands, including places like national parks, to indigenous stewardship.
It's a direct challenge to settler colonialism.
Absolutely. It aims to restore sovereignty and cultural practices. Also, removing colonial statues, renaming places, returning artifacts, language revitalization efforts. These are all forms of decolonization.
Okay. And then there's anti-racism. We touched on racism, but anti-racism is the active part.
Yes, it's crucial to see it as active. It's not just being passively not racist. It's about implementing policies and practices specifically designed to dismantle racism and promote racial equity.
And its roots go way back.
Oh, yeah. Early critiques of colonialism, the abolitionist movements fighting slavery, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. It has a long history.
Related to that is equity. How is that different from equality?
That's a really important distinction. Equality means treating everyone the same. Equity, on the other hand, means giving people what they need to have fair opportunities. It acknowledges that people are starting from different places because of systemic inequalities.
So it's about fairness, recognizing historical disadvantage.
Exactly. In education, for instance, equity might mean allocating more resources to schools in underserved communities to help close achievement gaps, rather than giving every school the exact same amount.
Got it. And all these strategies, movements, they're ultimately aiming for liberation.
Liberation is the goal, yes, and it's a really comprehensive idea. It's about achieving freedom from oppression in all its forms, political, economic, cultural, psychological.
So it's not just removing the external chains, so to speak.
Right. It's also about developing critical consciousness, understanding the systems of oppression, and actively working to create more just ways of relating to each other. It's transformative.
Okay, let's make this more concrete by looking at some of the specific communities highlighted in ethnic studies. We can start with African American communities. Their history is obviously deeply marked by the transatlantic slave trade.
Absolutely. And its legacies are profound. One critical point is the loophole in the 13th Amendment.
Right, abolishing slavery except as punishment for crime.
Exactly. That loophole laid the groundwork for mass incarceration. It led directly to systems like convict leasing, which is basically slavery by another name, forcing predominantly Black incarcerated people into labor for profit.
And then came Jim Crow segregation.
Enforcing that separate and unequal status. But resistance was constant. The Civil Rights Movement, with huge moments like the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington, directly challenged that system.
And the Black Panther Party. They focused on self-defense and community programs.
Yes, founded in '66. They focused on protecting communities from police brutality, but also ran vital survival programs. Free breakfast for kids, health clinics. Their 10-point program called for fundamental changes, which of course made them a target for government programs like COINTELPRO.
And these issues continue today.
Tragically, yes, mass incarceration, police brutality, these are direct lines from slavery and Jim Crow. The George Floyd protests in 2020 brought that into sharp focus again. African Americans still face disproportionate rates of policing, incarceration, and violence.
And the intellectual traditions are rich.
Incredibly rich. W.E.B. Du Bois and double consciousness, the whole field of critical race theory pioneered by scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, and powerful Black feminist thought from figures like Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks.
Okay, let's turn to Native American communities. Their histories involve immense suffering, forced displacement, genocide.
Yes, events like the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, the California Genocide, these are horrific parts of U.S. history. And policies were aimed at destroying cultures.
Like the boarding schools.
Exactly. The infamous motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," sums up their brutal assimilationist goal. And the breaking of treaties like the Treaty of Fort Laramie regarding the Black Hills is another recurring theme. Even creating national parks often involved forcibly removing indigenous peoples from their homelands.
But again, resistance is key.
Always. The American Indian Movement, AM, founded in '68, used direct action to fight for sovereignty and treaty rights. Think of the occupation of Alcatraz.
Right, that was huge.
And the trail of broken treaties. Today, the land back movement is a continuation of that fight, demanding the return of ancestral lands. And environmental justice is central, connecting land defense to climate justice, like we saw at Standing Rock.
A major contemporary issue mentioned is MMIW.
Missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's an epidemic, reflecting historical neglect and violence. Murder is the third leading cause of death for Native women. It's a crisis demanding attention. And like other communities of color, Native Americans face hugely disproportionate incarceration rates.
Their intellectual traditions emphasize oral history, connection to land.
Yes, deep oral traditions, storytelling, land-based ways of knowing, and important scholars like Vine Deloria Jr.
Okay, shifting now to Chicanx Latinx communities. Their history in the U.S. is deeply tied to U.S. expansion, isn't it?
Absolutely. U.S. imperialism and land dispossession are foundational. The annexation of Texas, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ending the Mexican-American War. That treaty ceded huge amounts of Mexican territory and instantly turned Mexican citizens into a racialized minority within the U.S.
And labor exploitation was a major factor.
Huge. Migration driven by events like the Mexican Revolution and then programs like the Bracero program, which brought millions of Mexican workers under often terrible conditions.
Then came the Chicano movement, El Movimiento.
Right, in the 60s and 70s. A really multifaceted struggle for civil rights, economic justice, cultural pride. Key parts included the farm worker struggle led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta with the UFW. The Delano Grape Strike was pivotal. And demands for educational equity, like the East LA walkouts protesting inequality and pushing for bilingual education. Plus, an anti-war component protesting the disproportionate number of Chicanos dying in Vietnam.
And that activism continues today.
Definitely. Think about the DACA movement, the broader immigrant rights movement, often youth-led, pushing back against harsh border policies, family separations.
The Abolish IC movement came up too.
Yes, fueled by horrific stories of family separation, detention conditions. The material points out how private companies profit from detention and how rhetoric labeling immigrants as criminals serves to dehumanize them.
What about their rhetorical strategies and intellectual traditions? Chicanismo.
Chicanismo was a key philosophy, cultural pride, self-determination, rejecting assimilation, reclaiming the myth of Aztlán as a homeland. Slogans like "Si se puede" became symbols of collective power.
And culture.
Muralism, poetry, poesia were vital tools. Linguistically, using Spanglish and code switching became forms of resistance. Intellectually, you have the emergence of Chicanx studies, Gloria Anzaldua's groundbreaking borderlands theory exploring the U.S.-Mexico border as this unique space of mixing and powerful Chicana feminism, challenging sexism within the movement and broader society.
Okay, finally, Asian American communities. What are some key historical struggles?
Well, explicit exclusion, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law restricting immigration based on race. Then, the devastating Japanese-American internment during World War II, incarcerating over 120,000 people based purely on ancestry.
And more recently, post 9/11.
Yes, intense Islamophobia led to the racialization of people perceived as Muslim, Arab, or South Asian as security threats. The Muslim ban in 2017 caused immense hardship and family separation, particularly for Yemenis, Syrians, and Iranians.
And activism.
Crucial. The Third World Liberation Front strikes in 68-69 were formative. Asian American students, particularly through groups like the Asian American Political Alliance, AAPI, were central in demanding ethnic studies and actually coined the term Asian American as a political identity.
Wow, I didn't know they coined the term.
Yeah, it was a political act of solidarity. More recently, the Stop AAPI Hate Coalition formed in 2020 to combat the surge in anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, violence fueled by rhetoric echoing older yellow peril ideas.
And intellectually, what are some key ideas?
Understanding Asian American itself as a panethnic political construction born from shared experiences of racialization, critically analyzing the model minority myth is huge, showing how it denies racism and divides communities. There's also a focus on transnational connections, linking experiences here to U.S. foreign policy and imperialism abroad, and Asian American feminism, which tackles the intersections of race, gender, and class.
It's striking how, despite the very different histories, there's this common thread of coalition and solidarity.
It's absolutely central. The struggles for racial and social justice are deeply interconnected. Building alliances across communities has always been vital.
We saw that with the Third World Liberation Front strike.
It's a prime example. Asian American, Black, Chicanx, Native American students uniting, or the Delano Grape Strike, a powerful coalition between Filipino-American organizers like Larry Itliong and Chavez's largely Mexican-American UFW.
There's Black-Asian solidarity mentioned too.
Yes, a long history there, connecting anti-imperialism in Asia with Black power in the U.S. Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition is another amazing example, uniting Black Panthers, the Puerto Rican Young Lords, and poor white activists. Many Brown Berets also modeled themselves after the Panthers.
And more recently.
Standing Rock saw huge multiracial solidarity, Latinx support for Black Lives Matter. These connections continue because the underlying systems of oppression, white supremacy, racial capitalism, the prison system, imperialism are shared enemies.